Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Campaign University Facebook Live. I'm George Affleck. I'm here along with my co-founders, Mike Wilson and Emil Scheffel. Today, we have a true luminary in the world of politics joining us. And if you're planning or considering a run for office, I think you're going to find this conversation really, really helpful. It's my honor to introduce Don Guy, a legendary political strategist with an unparalleled track record of success. Over the last 25 years, he's provided research-driven strategies for a myriad of successful political, public, and corporate campaigns. He's the owner of and chief strategist at Polaris Strategic Insights. Don made waves as the campaign manager for Ontario's iconic 2007 provincial election, where he led his team to a resounding victory by skillfully navigating the pivotal issue of school funding. We'll hear more about that. Today, we have the privilege of tapping into Don's wealth of knowledge as he shares invaluable insights on how to leverage issues to your advantage in campaigns. I'm going to let Mike take it over from here. Mike will conduct the interview with Don, and welcome, Don, and over to you, Mike.
Sounds great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you guys watching. Yeah, feel free to participate. Put your questions in below, as George says, and we're really excited. Don, thank you so much for being here. We're going to, just so everyone knows timelines, we're going to ask Don a bit about the 2007 campaign. Truly fascinating how it unfolded. Hopefully you've all seen that CBC video we've also posted in the group on some of the clips from the campaign, which are, they live in my mind forever. We're going to ask Don too about how he developed the 2013 campaign for the BC Liberals and Christy Clark, which was this crazy come from behind victory, as many of you know. And then we're going to leave time for your questions and talk about just how to use issues in campaigns. So thanks so much, Don, for being here. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we shared the video of 2007 with a lot of people watching today, and it's also in the group. But could you tell us a little bit? So there'd been a promise made, I guess, in 2003 that you had made that there would be no new taxes, and I guess there were some new taxes over the next 4 years. So you were on the eve of election. That tax kind of promise, or mistaken promise, was looming on you. How were the polls? How were things looking? What was your mindset going into the campaign?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. And I'll just give it like a quick little background on that because I think it's important. So 2003, based on what the province reported in its budget preceding the campaign in 2003, which was a balanced budget, the leader of the opposition at the time made a commitment not to raise taxes. It was seen as a critical weakness for Liberals. So it was important to close that vulnerability off, which he did, and which got a lot of attention through paid advertising on television in particular. Upon forming government, and I remember because I went in as the chief of staff, the first briefing, and some of you've been in this circumstance, that first transition briefing with the senior public servants, including the deputy minister of finance, and they said, yeah, the books aren't balanced. There's actually a $6 billion deficit. So you're not going to be able to keep any of your promises. So it became a choice of which promises to break. And in the end, and this was, lots of people had lots of advice in cabinet and caucus and in the premier's office and outside. But the premier made a pretty solitary, gutsy decision that he would raise tax through one stroke, which was reintroduce the Ontario health premium. And then he would tie that to the main issue of the 2003 campaign, which were healthcare waiting lists. So he said, I'm going to raise this money by bringing this back. I'm going to use the money to clear the healthcare waiting lists. And then our feet were to the fire, because if we didn't, then we weren't going to be forgiven. But if we did, then there was a route out from under the broken promise. So dealing with that took a lot of the work, and as chief of staff, that took a lot of my attention in making sure that those commitments on clearing healthcare waiting lists were met, and they were cleared. But there was still this broken promise overhang thing, because it was a very significant promise, and the Conservatives in particular were planning on making that their major theme. They were portraying their leader, John Tory, as someone of superior integrity to our guy. So the design of the campaign sort of took off from those things. Number one, we knew we had to dispose of the broken tax promise in a very clear way, because we wanted the campaign to be about something else, obviously, than whether we did or didn't break a promise. As everybody on this call knows, if you're working within your opponent's frame, you're almost always going to put yourself in a difficult position. I'm a big believer in the George Lakoff framing approach to campaigns. And we needed to get out of that frame and create space for the other one.
Right.
So on the schools thing, what had happened was, and there's been all kinds of stories told about this, but the 2002 provincial budget, then Finance Minister Jim Flaherty introduced a private school tax credit. So rather than direct funding, it was a tax credit of, I think, up to $500 that parents with children in private schools, regardless of whether they were religious or parochial or whatever the case may be, could apply for and receive to offset their tuition costs. That was very unpopular and was a contributing factor in that government's defeat. And needless to say, when we got in, we got rid of that. Mr. Eves resigned, I think, on election night or shortly after as the Conservative leader. There was a leadership race the following year in 2004. And this was one of the hot issues for the Conservative leadership race. So two of the candidates supported it from the beginning. Mr. Flaherty, obviously, and he had strong stakeholder relationships that were going to deliver significant delegates to him based on his track record and his commitment. Frank Cleese, who was also contesting and had also been in the Harris and the Eves cabinets, was also strongly supportive, and he had some ties to some slightly different religious communities, so had a stakeholder appeal there as well. And Mr. Tory privately disagreed with it and went for most of the leadership not making a commitment.
Right.
Until the night before the vote, when he made a private commitment to a number of the stakeholders that were supporting Mr. Flaherty. That led to so they went into that basically tied the night before. They were tied, and because Tory's modeling suggested that if they were tied or more or less tied on the first ballot, that Cleese would get enough support on the second ballot, or Cleese would deliver enough support on the second ballot to Flaherty and put him over the top. So they needed to move those numbers, and this was the bold stroke that they did to move them, and they did. So they were very clearly in first.
Classic, for our members, where you make a promise in leadership to win the leadership that you need to properly deal with after. But I guess you knew that he had done that in private, right?
We knew, because we had some sources that were in the room, and we knew that he had done that against his better judgment.
Right.
So I love it when you get politicians in that position, because he basically flip-flopped to get votes. And that suggested to us that we could probably make him flip-flop again to back to something closer to who he was, particularly if there was pressure coming over the course of an election campaign. So, we sort of quietly did our homework leading up to 2007. We didn't really ever talk about it, that he had made the commitment, even though we knew he had, because we wanted to have an element of surprise. So they went through their process. They put it in their platform in June 2007, their party platform. They released it. It got some attention. They played it as a fairness issue. And we felt that if we were to fight it on a fairness frame, the best we could do is fight to a draw. And they were ahead in the polls at that point, so that's not going to do us any good. Instead, what we found through focus group research, and in these groups, we didn't do a lot of talking, and we've all been here, everybody on this call, where you're in a focus group and you got a bunch of creative to test, and basically the moderator is doing all the talking. And there's very little opportunity for the respondents to actually reveal how they're actually feeling about something. So we did next to no talking in these groups. We just put this out there and said, what do you think? And listened. And what people said was, yes, it's probably fair. It's fair. I support it on that basis. But the more they started talking, it became about taking something away from their kids.
Right.
Because unlike the tax credit, Mr. Tory made a commitment for direct government funding of religious schools, but not increasing the overall education budget.
Right.
So they were right. I mean, as they talked themselves through this, they realized that it would mean cuts to public schools. And it was at that moment that we kind of realized that's the frame. And if you put it in that frame, you didn't have the 55% support that the Conservatives were saying for the policy based on fairness. You had something more like 75% opposition.
Right.
And Mike, as you know, I'm a big believer in you find the issue where 66% of people strongly agree with you, and then you stick with that issue. Even if it's nowhere near the top of latent concern. Salient concern.
How did you switch the frame in the public's eye? So if people are thinking fairness kind of on election, the eve of the election, how do you get it from fairness to public school cuts?
We started the week. So the writ came down, I think, on or around September 10th. So we actually had a few days of getting ready for school,
right.
Where, the teachers are back in the classroom the week before. At least here they are, and they're getting ready and they're buying their supplies and organizing their classrooms and stuff like that. So it was a great moment, great opportunity to put the premier and auxiliary tour as well in classrooms as part of the tour, talking about this issue and talking about what the consequences were potentially as teachers were meeting with their teacher's aide for the first time, or were actually giving up their supplies. And it right away became super tactile as opposed to academic or philosophical.
Right.
And we let it be known. And there was a headline. There were two headlines 2 days back to back where, basically Dalton challenged Tory on this for 4 or 5 days in a row. Right. And said, I'm staking my re-election on this. And Tory maybe had to rise to the debate, maybe he didn't, but he did.
Right.
And he said, I'm 100% in on this. And at that point, we had the question of the campaign. And to your point, Mike, so we did that for a week before the writ came down, and then we did it every event in every market for 11 consecutive days on tour.
Wow. We've been talking about this a lot, in our training and our lessons, just the need for this discipline and to fight the urge to move on, right?
Yeah, and the media. So the last Ontario campaign is a great example of a less disciplined approach, and the media were saying, I guess, just a couple of the campaigns that didn't end up being successful. We're tired of covering this thing you're talking about. Why didn't you give us something to write? Well, the minute they're doing that, you're actually starting to get through. And it's tough on, and don't get me wrong, right? It's really tough on the politicians. It takes an incredible degree of discipline and commitment to do that, for more than 2 weeks, talk about nothing but, and stay on message. But we were very fortunate that Dalton was one of those kinds of politicians who could do that, and that John was not. Right. So that was another aspect of what we were trying to do, is apply pressure through that lens. We had nothing on TV in terms of 30s, but that issue as well.
Right. I remember being in the background creating some other ads, but they never saw the light of day. It was I think right to the end, it was that issue, right to the end.
Yeah, I think in the last week because we had established that public-private frame in some respects with that. So I think some selective healthcare based on a couple of his healthcare commitments went up, and I think selective coal-fired electricity plants went up as well. But the only other spot that we ran was, and this is, we bought on every network and every local station, the 30 immediately, it was actually a 60, sorry, the 60 immediately preceding the leaders debate, the only televised leaders debate. And we had a piece of creative that we shot wild a few months before, where the premier just talked about how difficult it was to make the decision to raise taxes.
Right.
And so everybody who tuned in, and it was a couple million people, most people saw that spot before they went into the debate. And we knew from, again, our focus group research that it was very compelling. But it was also compelling that he said, if I hadn't done that, we wouldn't have gotten these wait times down. This is hundreds of thousands of people who got the care they needed, and I'm not going to change it. And Tory was running against getting rid of it.
Right.
No Conservative Party in Ontario since has run on getting rid of the health premium.
Right. Actually, Ford was on adding staff, right? Even.
Yeah. So it's now accepted back into the dialogue here. At least it hasn't been. And by the way, we're living in an age where everything is contested or being recontested. So I fully expect that somebody will go out and contest it in a campaign in the future. But that was the circumstance, and that disposed of the issue.
Right.
And I remember being on set for the debate, and so the leaders are all standing there getting ready. They're at their podia or whatever the word is, and they see the spot as they're getting ready for their cut in, and Tory just did this big gasp.
Right. Wow.
And I think that it caught him off guard a little bit. It kind of defanged what I think he thought his attack was going to be. And it let our guy focus on the schools question. So the debate became almost entirely about the schools question. And the campaign then became almost entirely about the schools question. And as it percolated more and more, in particular in base Conservative ridings, it was their own caucus that were making the most noise because they were hearing from their constituents.
Right. And
that's what a
crazy videos coming out, like the two ladies at his own event, or
yeah.
You talked to. There was one you were tipped off about him going to his old house.
Yeah, it's a crazy story. So it just happened that my brother lived around the corner from the house Mr. Torrey grew up in. And they decided to do some, I guess they had some extra time. Maybe an event was canceled, whatever. And he wanted to go back in his old neighborhood in Canvas, I think, to sort of lift his spirits. So the debate was September 20th. And he finally flip-flopped again on October 1st and said this was a mistake and we're not going to do it. And there was another, drop that cost him in the short term as well. But so this was about 2-3 days before that. And anyways, my brother calls me and says, you won't believe it, but Tory's bus has just pulled up here and he's out knocking on doors. I think he's going to go knock on the door of his old house. And I don't think he realizes that these are people who are voting Liberal because they are really mad about this schools thing. So he had no media with him. So we scrambled to get some cameras there, some media there. And you folks know how media typically respond if they're excluded from something. So they were loaded to go. And anyways, he goes to the door, knocks on the door, and says, I grew up in this house and hope I encounter your support. And they just blasted him, just like those two ladies. So, it was the bookend to those two things. And I think those encounters together with the pressure from caucus really had an impact on him, and he flip-flopped.
And did you know the win was going to be as big as it was? Like, did your numbers track with how well you'd actually end up in that on election night?
Yeah, we did. And we knew we had the frame. We knew we had the numbers. We went into that with 66 or 67 seats because we lost a series of by-elections on the broken tax promise thing. So we were down from 72 to 66 or 67. And the other thing that we had going for us on this question, and Mike and Emil have heard me on this before, is, it's not just the dialogue and the exchange of votes between you and your principal opponent. It's what are the other outlets for voters to go if for whatever reason they're not going to come with you. And there were two parties that were opposed to the school tax credit thing, us and the Greens. And so the Greens actually got a record result, including in a lot of ridings they hadn't traditionally done well in, based on this question. So there was another place for them to go if they didn't want to vote Conservative based on the question, but they didn't like Liberals. And that played a big part in the seat mix as well.
Right. Oh, it's fascinating to hear those stories. I also wanted to ask about 2013. Obviously, many of our Campaign University members are heavily involved in politics and in and around that campaign, just how you developed it. But I also want to leave time for questions. So maybe another time you can talk about your big LNG frame and how you came up with all that, as it's definitely a memorable election out here, still to this day, a decade later. But why don't we take a few questions that have come in? Maybe George will start, and then Emil, you can take some from the group.
Well, yeah, thanks, Mike. A couple of ones related to the flip-flopping. Is that one of the deadliest sins that you can do in politics, you think?
Yeah, I do. I think that, and many people on this call have heard me on this, trust in the category of politics is so low now, undeservedly, I would argue. Just about everybody I've met in politics from every party is in it for the right reasons and has a lot of integrity. But that's not the way it's portrayed in our popular culture, and there are lots of different flashpoints and good reasons for it. But I think the mistake he made, honestly, was flip-flopping in the first place. And, I'll just tie this quickly to Mike's question. What we had going for us in 2013 and what we had going for us in 2007 is Dalton believed so passionately in what he was achieving in education. And it's why he got into politics. It's why he ran for leader. He was prepared to lose on that question. And it showed.
Right.
He was, it showed through his eyes. He was on fire.
Right.
And Christy was the same. Christy does not get enough credit for the vision that she laid out on LNG. And look around the world, everything she said was right.
Right.
And if there's a tragedy in all of what happened here, it's that Oregon let it all go. And where are we now?
Yeah.
So, that's another pod. Let's have another one on that, because
Yes.
she was a visionary and she believed it with her heart and with her gut, and she went and communicated it.
And that's obviously provincial politics here in British Columbia, where we're based. One of the reasons we started this whole Campaign University thing was because, for me as a former politician, and Mike and Emil having been in the behind the scenes, and you probably see this as getting people interested in running. And one of the pushbacks we always get is, my history when I was in high school, like whatever, my social media, I said something once on social media. And I always argue, well, Trump is definitely a case study of, of the nth degree of what you can do and still keep, potentially win. I think that, not that I would use that as a specific example, but I think, has the world changed in accepting your mistakes from the past if you want to run for office? Because otherwise, I look at young people right now who may have posted things in their teens and in their minds, they never can run for office. How do we get around that concern by people who might be really, really competent elected officials?
Well, you're on to one of my main things, George. It's a great question. What people are looking, and this relates to the previous point about the lack of trust, what people are looking for is humanity, connection with some degree of humanity. And everybody's human, everybody's mortal, everybody makes mistakes. I'm a big believer that if you can accept that you've made mistakes and demonstrated that you've grown, and that you've been on a journey that has led to growth, and in fact your experience with your mistakes enables you to be more empathetic about the voters' challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Then not only are they going to be forgiving, but in some ways they're going to elevate you above a sterile, antiseptic sort of scrubbed clean image. I don't like candidates who embrace that kind of scrubbed clean, nothing to see here approach. So I think that's got to be, but we have to do a better job as people recruiting candidates for politics, to your point, in demonstrating why that would be true. We need to, frankly, be amassing some evidence, whether it's primary or secondary, that demonstrates that that's true. And it's because not just Trump's too unrelatable. He's because he's such a brand. Yeah. I think it's difficult for people to connect on that basis with his mistakes. And some of them are pretty odious, but I do think that there's more evidence than not that life experience serves you well,
no matter what,
versus none.
Yeah. Emil's got a couple of questions. Go ahead, Emil.
Yeah, John, fascinating. Really appreciate these insights. When we talk about sort of the issue mix and the frame of past campaigns, the sort of mainstream media has played a big role in setting those frames and setting those issues, right? Partly of their own volition, partly because of adept work by campaigners and candidates to sort of shape the questions the media are asking, what they're reporting on. In a world where, newspapers are in decline, CTV's hollowed out, the CBC may be in its final couple of years here, depending on the outcome of the next federal election. How do you think about campaigns for folks that are going to be running or or managing campaigns the next sort of 5 to 10 years as those trends in the media continue to unfold?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we were chatting a little bit about this on the pre-call. We would never, what we did with that tax promise thing by running at 30 before the leaders debate would never work today because there wouldn't be the eyeballs on it. You would need to make a massive investment in your digital audience and frankly curate that digital audience in advance of that, and then find a way to deliver that kind of message digitally, but knowing that you're doing so in a much lower attention span and more skeptical way. So any of the experiences that even that we had in 2013, which was primarily a television driven campaign, that world doesn't exist anymore. The audience is too atomized. And, the way that the federal liberals have dealt with it, as you know, is accepted that. And essentially they curate 25,000 different archetypes and deliver messages according to what those folks want to hear. That's consistent with what we see from, both Republicans and the Democrats in the U.S. in the larger scale races. And I think that trend is going to continue. I guess the question we have to ask ourselves, though, based on everything that's happening with Facebook and Instagram is, and even Twitter, is even these platforms, none of these platforms are permanent like the ones that we grew up with.
Right.
You might have 10, 20 years, and then that market's going to shift again. Look at the shift in audience from Facebook in terms of the demographics. Yes, it's ubiquitous, but engagement compared to Instagram among some pretty critical audiences is way down.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to see what happens with Twitter vis-a-vis Threads.
Yeah, we were talking about that before you got on even. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and you have to cover all the ground, right? And but I think it goes back also, just as you're talking, to the authenticity, right? Even in the digital age, people want to see something real. So if you can get real, and especially in the digital age, they'll scroll quickly past anything scrubbed or anything that looks polished,
Yeah. On that note, we've got a really good audience question here from John. John's question, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but he sort of calls out the prevalence of sort of celebrity household name candidates like Justin Trudeau, like Doug Ford. Is there still room in the political process, or how do you carve out room for folks that are not household names, might have really good policy ideas, really strong platforms, but are starting from behind and building a profile with voters?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I would say, in 2007, we were up against one of those household names, John Tory, at least in Ontario and certainly in the GTA. I think there's no question it's an advantage because if they recognize the name and they have some sort of positive association with it, then they start with an advantage. But you, as somebody on the other side, what that's about, and that sets up a set of expectations that present a target for you and potentially a vulnerability, as they did with John. John's his image of integrity set him up in some respects when he flip-flopped the first time and then was forced to flip-flop again. And it took him a long time to recover that, and he subsequently did and had an interesting run here as the mayor of Toronto. But I think these things come in cycles. I don't think this is a permanent or enduring feature of politics, at least in Canada. Although if Ben or Caroline Mulroney becomes the next Conservative leader, I may have to eat my words. So.
You touched on rogue politicians, or you talked on being committed to the messaging, and this is something we talk about a lot. But we have a rogue politicians, and not talking about the leader. Leaders sometimes should stay committed. But what do you do when you're running a campaign team and you've got multiple candidates who just won't stick to the message? And you're like, guys, trust me. This, I know it only feels like you're saying the two things over and over again, but it works. How do you overcome that for especially new politicians who it's their first time and they really just want more stuff to talk about?
You know, George, it's such an interesting question, right? Because our tendency is want to impose discipline and do what you're told, as opposed to sometimes we're better off listening, accepting, adapting, and then coming back to. And that's not something that happens by email. That's something that happens, you know, one-on-one, like we're having our conversation, or on the phone or whatever the case may be. And it's multiple contacts, because at the end of the day, it's no different. Your relationship with your candidates, your candidate teams or whatever is also premised on trust. And none of us are owed trust. We have to earn it in our relationships, including in those.
All right, guys, we should probably wrap it up. Mike, you want to wrap it up and do the thanks?
Yeah, sure, Don. We just really appreciate you being here. Maybe we'll get a chance to do it again. But fascinating, the background information and just hearing the ins and outs of how these decisions are made. It's invaluable experience. So thanks. And we have a lot of people running for office. So you're running Pollara polling. So if they want incredibly accurate polling, we will recommend Don give his company a call at Pollara. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you.
I want to say thanks. I think this is such an important initiative, and it fills a massive gap in the system. So, you know, really excited for what you three are accomplishing with this, and same to everybody on the call. Let's bring more people into this thing, because it has so much potential, and it's going to have a lot of impact.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Don. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll look forward to doing it again.
Thanks,
Okay.
Don.
Thank you.